Hey everyone, Jeremy here. Welcome back to the Towards Data Science podcast. And today we're talking about two fascinating questions that don't seem related at all, but actually are. The first one is very simple. If you had $100 and you wanted to use it to create as much joy, prosperity, and well-being in the world as possible, what would you spend it on? The second has to do with our long-term future as a species. Are we on the brink of an AI-powered economic revolution? And if so, what can we learn about the history of human economic activity up until now that we might use to help us navigate that transition when it happens? So today I'll be exploring those questions with my guest David Roodman, who's a senior advisor for Open Philanthropy. Because of his role at Open Philanthropy, David spends his time exploring questions that are as big as they are practical. And these are things like, does tough-on-crime legislation do more harm than good, or can we meaningfully reduce poverty by using strategies like microcredit? And as we'll see, he's also done a lot of interesting thinking on predicting when advanced AI systems might overtake human beings in our reasoning abilities. The conversation was just a ton of fun, and it connected so many different ideas that I hadn't linked together in my own mind before. I hope it does the same for you. I hope you really enjoy it. And without further ado, I'll step out of the way and let it start. Well, David, thanks so much for joining me for the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to have you. I discovered you through not through your book actually on microcredit, which is really excellent, really cool, but rather through a post that you wrote about sort of long-termism and long-termism view through the lens of AI. And I really want to dive into that. I think I want to dive in as well into a number of explorations you've done, sort of re-examining some earlier results that people had put together in the sort of philanthropy space about what initiatives are worth investing in and which may not be. So we've got a lot to talk about, but before we get to that, I'd like to situate things a little bit and talk about your background. So what brought you to this space of altruism and to Open Philanthropy, which is where you're working now?
Well, I'm old enough that could take an hour to tell you all that, but I'll try to avoid that. I am a child of divorce, and in some ways, I think my life has been about trying to fuse the aspects of my personality that my parents gave me or inculcated in me over the course of my life. So my dad introduced me to computers when I was 12 years old. I learned my first programming was on punch cards on an IBM mainframe. And so that's been a part of my life, and I've always been interested in coding and mathematics. But my mother was also someone who came in early adulthood, really was part of the feminist movement of the 1970s. And she, gave us, my sister and I, a strong sense of our responsibilities as citizens, and I've always been trying to figure out how to combine my interest in public policy and public welfare with my tendency to code and think about things mathematically. And so in retrospect, it can all seem like it was obvious, but I didn't know how it was going to work out. But I spent a lot of time working for think tanks in Washington, D.C., which is where I live. Those are generally, funded by foundations, philanthropies, in order to do analysis of complicated problems that's relevant for actual decision making. So I've learned about a lot of different topics over the years through that kind of work.
Interesting. Yeah. And one of the things I find particularly intriguing about Open Philanthropy is it is sort of focused or embedded in this matrix of effective altruism, sort of effective altruist community. And one through line there really is looking critically at the kinds of problems that we invest money in solving and asking, is this really the best place for our money to go? That's led to some pretty interesting counterintuitive decisions in terms of like what does get funded. Would you mind kind of providing a bit of an overview? Like what are some of the more maybe surprising things that you think are worth funding that people might not realize?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I work at a place called Open Philanthropy, which is based in San Francisco. It's essentially a foundation, although it doesn't actually hold a lot of assets. Rather, it makes recommendations to make grants. And most of the money that we're influencing now comes from Dustin Moskovitz and his wife, Carrie Tuna. Dustin was one of the founders of Facebook. And I've been there 4 or 5 years. And you're absolutely right. It very much is influenced by the philosophy or the way of thinking that's called effective altruism, which is about kind of like I was just describing in a different way, about myself. It's about trying to connect a commitment to making the world a better place with tough-minded thinking about what actually works and what's most important. And through a process that I don't want to take much credit for, I have great admiration for, but wasn't closely involved with, we have isolated maybe 3 or 4 major cause areas and some minor ones, and we're adding to that list over time. And some of them, interestingly, seemed kind of weirder and crazier when they were first chosen 4 or 5 years ago than they do now. So we were working on pandemic preparedness when that took a lot of explaining, right? Obviously, our grants did not stop the pandemic, but hopefully we're making some difference in the response and in preparation for future ones. And also, we've been important grant makers in criminal justice reform in the United States, trying to reduce the number of people in prison, because per capita, the United States is by far the highest in the world in incarceration, with the possible exception of North Korea, which is, not a flattering comparison. So we've been working hard on that, and that has gained a lot of steam in the last few years since we started working on it. Another one for us is farm animal welfare, which can sound a little funny, but there are billions of farm animals suffering right now, all the time. And if you even say that, a chicken's life counts 1% as much as a person's life, and you do the math, that's a lot of suffering compared to human suffering. And if with campaigns to get corporations to commit to changing how they farm can make big differences for billions of animals with only millions of dollars, that's pretty good bang for the buck. So those are some of the areas that we're working on. Another one, which of course we'll talk about, is, and this also is something that seems less crazy than it did, say, 5 years ago, is AI safety. Trying to do what we can to make artificial intelligence safe for society, so it's more a source of benefit than harm.
What I find really interesting here is there seems to be thematic interplay between all those initiatives in kind of subtle ways that might not be obvious, not the least of which is the way I often feel personally when I talk to people about AI safety is a lot like a person in like January 2020 must have felt if they were talking about the coronavirus, where you have this exponential process, or as you've pointed out, super exponential process that's unfolding that has the potential to take us all by surprise. You can see where the math leads if you just carry it forward iteratively over time. And yet our everyday lives really don't seem to reflect that underlying reality. Is this something that you've gotten good at sort of conveying or arguing? Like how do you get people to understand sort of more abstract risks and get them to take them seriously?
That's a great question, and it's really one of communication. I don't know if I'm especially good at it. I'm someone who likes to get immersed in a set of ideas and then explain those ideas as well as I can, sort of like a teacher. But if you're not a motivated student, you may still not buy it. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure I have much intelligence to say, except that you need to do things like make your arguments really concrete, draw on metaphors, connect to people's life experiences. We can talk much more convincingly now about preparing for the next pandemic, having been through one, because that's an easy example.
Yeah.
I should say that, what I just listed a bunch of cause areas, and they do seem like a kind of a grab bag: AI safety, farm animal welfare, but they come out of a process, some of whose virtues I think you've just illustrated. That is to say, we were able to arrive at priorities, even though there was a certain failure of imagination that makes it difficult to see why those are important. Mm. And we did that partly by being systematic, asking lots of people what they thought was important, and then reflecting on that. And then we had some filters, looking for things that have potentially very large impacts that are important, that can affect millions or billions of people or animals, looking for things that are neglected. So that's part of why it's a bit of a grab bag, because we're looking for stuff that most other foundations are not paying attention to. So it doesn't mean that we think these are the only important things. It's just where we think we can do the most good.
Yeah, that's always struck me as one of the more difficult, from a human level relatability standpoint, one of the more difficult aspects of adopting this kind of rational position is like you have to unfortunately be the one telling people like, yeah, that that metropolitan art grant or that whatever investment in even education in our communities or something like that is great, but this the marginal dollar could be spent better, doing this deworming campaign or focusing on AI safety or whatever it is. That kind of seems like there's a risk there, right? Because you can put people off, I suppose, if you're not careful.
Yeah, right. And to an extent, we are willing to embrace that, For example, we're willing to say that we really think that there are some charities that are doing more good than others, or have better evidence that they're doing good. And that's an important conversation to provoke. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that all of us, spread our money among different things that range from rather selfish, like when we buy coffee for ourselves, to very selfless.
Mm.
And giving, for example, giving to your children's school is sort of somewhere in between there, right?
Yeah.
And we're not too interested in telling people how to make that allocation. We just want to say, okay, for the part of your spending that you want to spend in the most altruistic way, here's our advice, or here's what we're thinking about doing.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it's funny, the moment you talked about that spectrum between selfishness and altruism, I sort of start to see a lot of my day-to-day choices that I might consider altruistic reflected in that. It's like, you might be mentoring one person, but you really get the reward of seeing the smile on their face. You're the one who gets to consume that benefit. It's not like you're spending your time investing in something abstract. Now, speaking of abstraction, so I guess one skill, we talked about the necessity of arguing for these abstract risks, things that are worth funding that might not be reflected in our day-to-day experience of the world. One of the areas where that's a really big issue is AI safety. And I really loved, I read your piece, I was gonna say cover to cover, but it was a nice hefty blog post about sort of what we're looking at from the standpoint of human economic history, how that ties into AI. Without being too specific about where to start this conversation, I mean, I'd love to just hear you lay out what the baseline level of that argument looks like, and maybe we can poke at it and explore it.
Yeah. So as I said, we are making grants that are meant to get more people thinking and working on how to make artificial intelligence safe. Now, because we are a fairly reflective organization and one that values internal debate, even as that decision has been made, the people who run the foundation, notably my boss, Holden Karnofsky, have invited other people to challenge that thinking, or at least to sharpen our thinking about it. And so one of the key questions that's really hard to nail down is how likely is it that artificial intelligence could get to the point where it equals or surpasses human intelligence? And when might that happen? Because if we were somehow to be able to come to the conclusion that it's not going to happen, or it won't happen for 300 years, then that would call into question the value of our grant making. So it's in that spirit that I was asked to look at one particular angle on this question of the timing and likelihood of an artificial intelligence breakthrough. There are different angles. One can look at how much computation we think goes on in the brain, and then ask, when will it become affordable to make a computer do that much compute, and so on. The particular angle I was encouraged to look at was looking at the history over like 12,000 years or even 2 million years of economic output, or the scale of the human system. So I guess really there's two main ways we can look at the scale of the human system. One is the number of people, and the other is their economic output, what we would now call gross world product. And one of the really strange facts that emerges when you look really long term, not over a century, but over millennia, is that the larger the human system has grown, the faster its growth rate. And I don't even mean exponential growth, which is what we have like with the virus sometimes. I don't mean that it's grown at 3% a year and so it's gotten bigger and bigger. I mean, like, it used to grow at 0.1% a year, and then it grew at 1% a year, and maybe someday it'll grow at 10% a year or 100% a year. And so the question is, if we look at if we quantify the past, does that give us any insight into what the future might look like? Because it seems like if that were to give us more confidence of another economic explosion like the Industrial Revolution, it seems like the only way that could happen, at least the most plausible way that could happen, is with some kind of big artificial intelligence breakthrough.
One of the really interesting mathematical features, and I mean, I'll even call it alarming mathematical features of what you laid out there, really was, and I think it slips by you so easily when you say it, but the idea that time actually starts to effectively compress with human progress. And it's almost like, I think you mentioned at one point in the write-up, it's like, you're going to hit infinity in finite time. It's like one thing to say we will hit an arbitrary level of economic output at some point. At any, if you project out in the future, it's yeah, at some point we'll hit a global GDP of like, or GWP, that is, of however many trillion. But to say, no, we're going to hit that in finite time, by Tuesday next week, we're going to hit that point, is a much more dramatic statement. What to you, what does that event imply? Is there something like in your model of the world, like, do you think that means, I don't know what that could mean, actually. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you put it very well. And a point that I opened the blog post with is this strange fact that, if you plot the historical data series on gross world products, so, back in 10,000 BC, we very roughly estimate that it was like $1.6 billion. And today it's, I don't know what it was, 70 or 80 trillion, massive increase over that time. Anyway, if you plot the data points in a way so that they look kind of, I guess I should do it this way. I don't know. Well, they look sort of like a straight line, which means both axes are logarithmic. And then extended forward, it predicts that you'll get to infinite output. In my best model fit, you get to infinite output by 2047. And I don't take that seriously, right? I don't think we're going to have infinite output by 2047. But I do feel like there's something to learn there. Like, it's not optimal to just say, oh, that's stupid, and move to the next blog post.
Yeah,
like read it. But I feel like we have to ask the question, why is it that the simple model that best describes history predicts an impossible future? What should we make of that?
And I guess to the extent that this model has been very useful in terms of or let's say would have been very useful in describing the past 2 centuries of economic output, despite quite a few bumps in the road that seem to iron out over time, just to kind of fit this model again, like to suggest that, okay, now all of a sudden this 2047, it's just 27 years from now, that starts to really sharpen maybe the implications of this. Are there other economic models that have broken down in this way in the past that have sort of, that we can think about in retrospect and study?
When you say broken down, you mean have ended up being wrong, or have predicted these kinds of strange futures?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking like other areas where infinities might pop up, because I think your analysis was like, an infinity happens, so something weird is going to happen there. I'm curious about whether other economic models might have predicted infinities in the past, and what are the sorts of things that happen in those regimes?
Yeah, it's a good question. The basic observation that I just made is not new with me. I think probably, and I talk about this in the post, the first time it appeared really was in 1960, when it was done just with population, starting from the year 0. And again, the same point was made, that the authors predicted that we would have an infinite number of people on the Earth by 2026, Friday 13th in 2026. So that extrapolation is new. And somewhat distinctly in the world of economic modeling, I should say macroeconomic modeling, which is where you try to understand the dynamics of an entire economy, not a single factory. That's a discipline that really gained steam starting in the 1950s. They have often struggled with this question, that very natural models that you can write down that seem to fit the present tend to explode. And so they have worked sometimes with more contortion than others in order to avoid such strange implications, perhaps out of fear of not being taken seriously and not getting published. I should say that in the last 2 centuries, it's not clear that the simple model we've been talking about works as well. That there was a big, growth takeoff around the Industrial Revolution, but since then, growth in the industrial countries has been better approximated by an exponential model, where the growth rate each year is fairly steady, maybe 3% a year, rather than increasing. And so that could mean that already the model I've been talking about, where growth is accelerating, is archaic and is a thing of the past. Or it could just be like we're in, just a little random ripple in a longer term trend, and it's hard to know.
And do you think that there's a kind of an understandable reason why the model takes this shape. Like when we talk about time compression, the way I've always conceptualized it when I've heard arguments like this is it's something like, you know, one day some hominid in a cave comes up with like the idea of fire. And then fire allows us to do a task that might have taken us a month in 2 weeks. So effectively time has then compressed. And so we play this forward, Thomas Edison comes up with a light bulb. And all of a sudden, tasks that would have taken us a year take us 6 months, and so on and so forth. So it's effectively like there's a kind of compression. But I feel like that model, if anything, that model should make the last 200 years follow that trend even more. Like it seems like we've been better at coming up with new ideas and distributing them than we had in the past. So I guess I'm sort of like at this logical juncture where it's not clear to me which of my assumptions are failing me in that respect. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, that's well put. So what's interesting about this model we keep talking about of super exponential growth, of accelerating growth, is not just that it's a simple mathematical pattern that fits the history, but that there is an intuitive theory that you've just described that helps us understand why growth would accelerate over time. And that is technology. It only takes one person to invent fire, and then that idea can spread. And it only takes one person to invent semiconductors, and the idea can spread. And so the more people there are, and the more resources they have to engage in research, then the faster society should be able to generate new ideas, which then means more productivity, which means more ability to generate ideas. So it seems like that is an important dynamic that has occurred over the course of history, is acceleration in the pace of innovation, which then allows more acceleration. So the countervailing question is, and yes, we have more capacity for innovation in the world today than ever before. Countervailing idea, and there's a lot of serious argument for this idea, evidence and theory, is that maybe we're running out of things to discover. Even though it seems like things are changing so fast, there are a lot of ways in which life has not changed for people in industrial countries much over the last 50 years. The 747 has been in service for 50 years. We haven't really improved that much on it, except in some energy efficiency respects. And so, and if you look at the rate of innovation, for example, in physics, it doesn't seem like we're having the same breakthroughs today that they had 100 years ago. So, and those kinds of discoveries, basically things about quantum mechanics, really do translate into useful technology. And so when we stop making basic science discoveries, that may eventually mean we stop making important technological discoveries. And so this is a really important question to ponder. And I don't have any easy answers to it. I certainly don't dismiss the point of view that we are running out of things to invent. The big question, the big possible exception does seem to be artificial intelligence. If you can get machines to do, basically, if we can do for the brain what we've already done for most of the rest of the body, we've already got machines that are capable of locomotion, right? And that's been a major source of change in human affairs. If we can do the same thing for brains, that just seems like that could have radical implications.
Yeah, this is very much striking a chord in a context where I've been knee deep in Peter Thiel talking about the great stagnation and just this idea of atoms versus bits. And that often does seem to be the sort of dichotomy that people draw. They'll say we've made great progress in the world of bits since the 50s, computers and simulations and VR and iPhones. But in the world of atoms, we've, medical treatment seems to be slower, education's more expensive. You can almost just see these things plotted when you look at the comparative rates of inflation for products like housing and medicine versus products like electronics, which have just been deflating like crazy. It's, I guess, one of the things that your analysis makes me wonder about is the extent to which there's actually any meaningful distinction, though, between those two worlds in the long run. It seems as if perhaps we need to make a certain amount of progress in the world of bits because we've done all we could with physical meat bodies. Working on our own with our limited cognition, there's a sense in which we need to outsource some of that compute to bits, and that's the rate limiting step. Once we unblock that, perhaps things are going to change radically. Would that be a fair encapsulation of the thesis?
Of my thesis.
Yeah, sorry, the growth thesis, I guess. The idea.
Yeah, I think yes, I think that would be a fair encapsulation of the growth view. A couple of thoughts on that. One is, I think it is possible that there are major domains of the economy and of our lives that are just not going to be susceptible to that much innovation in bits. Like machines for moving us around can only become so efficient. We can't have 100x improvement there. This is one example. I'm personally interested in this question less because I really want to know whether economic growth is going to go to 40% a year,
Right.
compared to like 3% now. I'm less concerned about that than whether the models and the math are signaling to us the plausibility of some radical change. Mm-hmm. Just some radical economic change, which might not change every sector of our economy and our lives, but could still be really important, as important economically as the Industrial Revolution, or at least on that order.
And when you say radical change, I mean, I guess that sounds exciting, but it also sounds ominous. And you've alluded to AI safety. So I'd love to tie these two together. What is it that you think? So first off, what's your sense as to what could go wrong? And then what's your sense as to what we could be doing today to mitigate that?
Yeah, this is an area where I feel like I've read more than most people, but I don't feel like an expert, haven't written and spoken much about it. So I feel like I'm mostly, citing the thinking of others. There's some talk today around the ethics of AI and the societal effects of AI that focuses on whether we may be training in biases into our systems, things like that. I think we see that as important at Open Philanthropy, but we're more concerned about the things that could be more radical things that could change, how large parts of the economy work. The fear, to accentuate the negative, is that if you get agents that are capable of functioning in the physical world or the virtual world as effectively as human beings, and by agent I mean a soft combination of software and hardware, but they're running on silicon rather than on protein, which is what our brains run on. That if they can get as good as us, there's no reason to think that they couldn't become 10 times as fast as us a week later or a year later or 100 times faster, and that they couldn't multiply much more rapidly than humans can. And then there's just massive scope for unintended consequences, right? Not maybe the consequences would be intended by the AIs, but they wouldn't be intended by us. Most artificial intelligence agents are defined to optimize on certain goals. And so I think it was Eliezer Yudkowsky who first disseminated the idea of being paper-clipped, the paper-clipping idea, the idea that we could create an agent that was instructed to make as many paper clips as possible. And then it proceeds to turn the entire planet into paper clips because no one can stop it. So the point is not that an artificial intelligence would view us malevolently, but it just wouldn't care about us and would be incredibly capable by human standards of achieving whatever goal it was programmed to achieve. And so that's the kind of thing that we're worried about in the extreme. Presumably there's a spectrum of possibilities, and even if the extreme isn't realistic, it's hard to judge. It may be a stand-in for less extreme things that we can do something to prepare for by, for example, creating a culture of safety in artificial intelligence research the way we do in drug research and lots of other fields.
I find it really interesting, the emphasis on the culture of safety. That's definitely something that that resonates with me because, well, not least because it seems as though there are some technical problems with making these long-term future AI systems safe that we probably aren't even aware of today. Like there's a limited degree to which we can actually solve technical problems, perhaps, that will be relevant at that stage in the game. There are surely technical problems we can be working on today as well, but it seems like this is almost a part kind of technical challenge for today, and then a part cultural, kind of embedding the right values so that by the time we get to the stage where these kinds of machines are on the cusp of arising, we at least have some kind of coherence. Like people are aware of safety, they're aware of the paperclip type risk involved in this. Is there a division of emphasis at Open Phil on whether to focus on culture versus safety? Are both being looked at, or?
I'm not I don't know our programming or grant making intimately. I'm not sure that distinction would stand up, because at the end of the day, we're giving grants to try to support people in thinking about certain things rather than thinking about other things, and writing about certain things and talking about certain things rather than other things with their limited time. And at some level, that just is
Yeah.
culture change.
Yeah, that's true. I guess you get a bunch of people working on technical problems today that kind of seeds the technical research groups that end up
Yeah.
becoming, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now in terms of the paperclip bit, like one of the things I always find interesting when I have conversations with people about this is like, the paperclip seems like a really extreme example. You'll tell them like, you make an AI and you tell it optimize for paperclips, it realizes there's iron in the ground, there's iron in your blood, there's iron everywhere. Like I'll pull that out and just like reorganize the world to make a bunch of these. And it seems almost whimsical, but I guess one of the challenges I've always had is like, is conveying the fact that this actually applies to far more mundane things. Like, I think, as you say, Yudkowsky is focused on this question a lot. I think one example I saw him write about was, we'll know that we have a safe AI system when we can get an arbitrarily intelligent AI to just place a strawberry on a table. Like, something just like that simple. How do you define strawberry and how do you define table? Like, if you have a genie in a bottle that's arbitrarily powerful, like, slight differences in meaning can translate into massive differences in action. Um, is there, like, I guess you're not an AI safety researcher per se, but what's your level of optimism regarding whether we're able to meaningfully move the needle on this category of risk in the next, say, 20 years before 2047?
Yeah, mostly I don't know.
Mhm.
The philosophy at Open Philanthropy is that if we have a small chance of making a big difference, then we should try it,
Mhm.
unless the chance is so small that it's at some level it just seems pointless. And so that's the philosophy we're going with. I forget what the internal calculations are, but I think it's something like we think we have less than a 10% chance of making a difference. But if it's a 1% or 5% chance of shaping the next economic revolution, that's a great
Yeah.
use of philanthropic money. So mostly I've dodged your question. Yeah, I no one really knows. I'm optimistic about work that's being done on adversarial examples, because what I think it is helping us understand is, and also on work that tries to actually go inside the black boxes of these deep learning systems and figure out what algorithms they're settling on. Because adversarial examples are sort of, in some ways, they're the canary in the coal mine. They're showing how seemingly small changes in input can lead to very large changes in output. Suddenly, a picture that looks like an apple to us is classified as a panda bear, right? And the fact that we're on top of that now, or working on it now, is, I think, a good sign. And we are gaining insight into how these systems actually think.
Yeah.
And then maybe they'll, if we can demystify what's going on, that'll make it more easy to manage.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's certainly like a whole family of strategies, like clarity, and I think Chris Olah, formerly at OpenAI,
Yep.
now I think he's doing his own thing. But yeah, that's definitely a research program I'm excited about too. Now, going back to this idea of timelines, like, were you surprised by, first off, keeping in mind all the regular caveats apply? 2047 is, the result of modeling, so
Yeah.
who knows? But let's just say like the order of magnitude, like that 2047 isn't more than, it's not a lifetime away. I mean, it's on the horizon. Did that surprise you? And if it did, like, how did that affect your thinking about almost like, I want to say, life priorities in general? I mean, there's so many things that number implies, but yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. It has not affected my thinking on life priorities. I'm not expecting a singularity in whatever it is, 26 years. I'll say two things. One is, I think it did help me appreciate that the human system is unstable. That we're people, maybe a lot of people listening to this or watching this right now, you and I, we've experienced relative stability in our lives. Things economically, socially are pretty similar to what they were a few decades ago, even arguably 100 years ago.
Mm.
And I ran different versions of this model. In some cases, there was explosive takeoff. In other words, some other cases there was a takeoff and then a crash. And it's hard to make the system, under the rules I had given it, stabilize. So I thought that was sort of an important insight. I'm not sure where it leads practically. I will say more generally that this is part of a larger effort on my own part, just to understand things I think you understand at least as well as I do about the state of AI, how it works, where it's going. And I think through that process of coming just understand what is deep learning, for example, and learning about the recent progress, that my sense about, I now see human level AI, however you want to define that precisely, as more plausible than I did a few years ago. My mind has been shifted towards plausibility. When I came of age, it was laughable that a computer could beat a grandmaster in chess, right?
Yeah.
And now the reverse would be laughable.
Yeah.
So I've had to adjust my own priors, and so I do think it's I don't think it's as crazy as I once did.
And you mentioned the crashes in the model. That is something that I noted with less than glee as well. So what happened there? I mean, do you have any? Is there any explanation you can think of in terms of the mechanics of what might lead to those sorts of events as the curve goes up, and then all of a sudden down?
Yeah. The idea here also can be found works such as the limits to growth in the 1970s. In the variants where there's a crash, I introduced another factor of production along with labor and capital and technology. I added natural resources, and I plugged in the assumption that the more economic activity there is, the more we deplete those resources. So if there's an explosion towards infinity in economic resources, then within a microsecond, an explosion in economic output, within a few microseconds, you've depleted all the natural resources. And under the assumptions of the model, the economy then has to die. You can't subsist without any resources at all. So it crashes. So that suffices to at least show that you can have a simple model that produces accelerating growth throughout history, and yet does not predict positive infinity going forward, for what that's worth.
Makes me think of Nassim Taleb's the happiness of the turkey over time. All of a sudden,
I haven't seen that. But I will say, as caveats to that, as a prediction, built into the simple mathematical structure there is the assumption that people don't change anything about their behavior as the world changes. They just keep using resources at the same rate relative to their economic activity. They don't adjust to circumstances, which I think is pretty unrealistic. Of course, that doesn't mean we're incapable of overshooting and crashing. It just is clearly plausible too.
And interesting. So in your view, then, like, if your gut, obviously nobody knows, and everybody's poking at different parts of the elephant here, but do you consider like the future of humanity as being like either an unbounded infinity or a crash to zero? Basically, it's like one of those two, and there more or less isn't really a middle ground. Would that be your perspective?
No, I know it's what comes across in that blog post, because that's where the particular simple models I was working with led. I mean, I would say I would put more expectation on a muddle in the middle. I think we're going to do a lot of harm as humans. I think we are adjusting our behavior a lot. Maybe not in time to avoid substantial harm, but in time to forestall the worst outcomes.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I find myself like when I look at those curves, even if I assume that the curve itself is a curve of goodness, and that's its own problem, right? Because like we look at these numbers, we're looking at gross world product or GDP or whatever the metric is, and it's just like there's an unease that I have even as I see that number go to infinity, that has to do with, I think, my own primal need for constancy and consistency and things not changing too much. And it's like, this is going to sound really weird, but I find myself in a way almost rooting for the crash to zero outcome, just because at least it's bounded. At least I can conceive of a universe where humans don't exist, whereas one where everything is just like an AGI that's gone crazy, and or
Yeah.
whatever form that would take. I don't know. I mean, at an emotional level, there seems to be that resonance to it.
Yeah, no, I share that. I understand what you mean. Maybe I should explain that one thing that was going on in my work is that I was incorporating into these mathematical models something called the stochastic calculus, which was new to me and is often used in modeling stock markets. It's a way of bringing randomness into calculus.
Hmm.
So, instead of having beautiful curves like you learn about in your calculus class, you have random wiggles with overall patterns. And that to me just seemed like a very good way to approach modeling human economic history, because there has been an overall pattern, but lots of ups and downs. The Black Death, and other pandemics actually, and world wars and so on. And that turned out to be such a complicated thing to try to bring to build a stochastic calculus model that had the overall acceleration that I was looking for, that I had to keep everything else pretty simple. Maybe people who are watching have that experience. You're building something complicated and it's just an achievement to get the new idea to work, that you don't want to introduce any other complications until you got that piece working right. And that's kind of where I was. And to that extent, that's part of why in some of in other ways, the blog posts and the analysis is very simplistic. It only predicts infinite takeoff or crashing to zero, because that was a level of sophistication I could achieve while still bringing in the stochastic calculus.
Yes, it's still interesting that it was so consistent in its output. Like I remember looking at, when you're introducing your use of Ito calculus, stochastic calculus, and then you showed all those curves. They did all have like a strikingly consistent shape, and I think there was one criterion you looked at too, which was like, by the time you reach a certain level of economic activity, the probability of this curve going all the way to infinity starts to go up like really fast. Like it seems like there's a baseline level of economic activity that we've long since crossed, beyond which you're like, yeah, now you're really into singularity territory or whatever. Can you speak to that cutoff a little bit and what you may have learned about it?
Yeah, well, the model I've developed has a notion of depreciation in it, which is standard in economics. It's the notion that things wear out, people die. So you have two dynamics in tension. One is that stuff wears out at an exponential rate, an exponential decay. The other is that as the system grows, its capacity for innovation picks up, which then can accelerate growth. And what that means is there's a rough cutoff, and if humanity starts below it, then it's liable to just go extinct.
Hmm.
As most species do, right? There never would have been human history. And if it's just above it, in a stochastic model, it can either escape that threshold and take off, or it can wobble around it for a long time, or maybe go below it eventually and crash. All possibilities are possible. And so that sort of gives you a way of representing the fact that for millennia, there wasn't that much increase in the scale of the human system until a takeoff occurred.
And then once it did, I guess, do you have a sense of like when, based on your models, like around even like what year we crossed that threshold where, it now becomes almost inevitable that we get to 2020 with computers and whatever else?
I think, well, in the graphs that I focus on in the blog post, I start the simulation of world history at 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago. And as I recall, it was something like 95 out of 100 paths that start where we were in 10,000 BC with a very small economy, eventually do take off.
Wow.
So even then, the best fit of the model, I mean, it's sort of a post facto thing.
Yeah.
You fit the model to the data, and then the model says the data what you should get. It says that according to the model, there's a 95% chance of eventual takeoff. Now, in some of the runs, that takeoff could occur 5,000 years later.
Yeah.
So it's like they just happened to invent the wheel 5,000 years later, and everything kind of, rolls on from there.
But it does seem to imply that there's something about our neural hardware that was already present at that stage. Like, again, assuming the model's correct, and I should reinforce your your warning there. This is it's all modeling and low dimensional stuff. But it's kind of interesting that it has you think a little bit about like, were all the ingredients in place such that the moment we deviated from the line that led to chimpanzees evolutionarily, like maybe even at that moment things were baked in. We were always going to end up with the iPhone, and it was just a matter of time. Like it's sort of it's fascinating from that perspective in terms of what it says about us physically as computation.
I think you can make that case more convincingly if you go to the development of language, which, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but from what I read, it looks like that has been dated to 40 or 50,000 years ago, which is remarkably recent. You know, we split from chimpanzees, what, like 5 million years ago? I can't remember now. And so hominids, recognizably human species, have been on this planet for a couple million years. And only 30 or 40,000 years ago was this thing called language developed. And yeah, it does kind of seem like from that point on, you know, there was a certain inevitability about it.
I guess there's also like a zooming out question, which says, you know, we can talk about what in the fraction of worlds where humans arise, in how many of those worlds do you get some kind of singularity, some kind of takeoff in the long run? But if you zoom out even further, I mean, I could imagine asking like, is that curve really the story of humanity? Or is it the story of apes? Is it the story of mammals? Is it the story of life itself? Or even more fundamentally, like, does it tell us a story about whatever optimization process the universe itself is running? Like with atoms and molecules and protons and whatever else, kind of mixing them together. And then I mean, this is obviously the totally unanswerable, like Fermi style question, but like, you know, in what fraction of universes do you naturally just get a singularity? Is that some weird feature? And I mean, conspiratorially, I might sound conspiratorial here, but like, is that a feature and not a bug even of this universe? Like, is it designed to lead to that end or whatever else? It seems to invite so much interesting speculation from such a simple model too, which is what I find so exciting about it.
Yeah, no, it invites a lot. It's true. I tend to think, I think that's again well put. I tend to think that life is baked in. That's, you know, it started so quickly on Earth in Earth's history. There is a vein of scholarship that argues that actually intelligent life, on the other hand, is not so clear. If you know, that maybe we are really alone in the universe in that respect. And the data point for that is that the Earth is expected to become uninhabitable in about 800 million years. So intelligent life emerged on Earth, wherever it is, like 80% of the way through its habitable lifespan. And so it's just as we've been talking about accidents of history and the invention of the wheel. Very easy to imagine, for example, if the meteor hadn't struck Earth 65 million years ago, that intelligent life would never have evolved on Earth.
Right.
And that was an improbable event. And one can then, of course, generalize the entire universe if one is brave.
Yeah, there's a lot of that does seem to have to happen. Yeah, it's really interesting and humbling too in its own way. Partly because it always seems to reveal our total ignorance about all these priors. There's so much like the numerator is 1, and we have no idea what the denominator is. Type issues that keep popping up here. Now, switching gears maybe to something a little bit more day-to-day, kind of pragmatic, because I know there are other initiatives that you've been working on, that Open Phil's been working on, and some of your really exciting work in this area has been like looking at some of these studies, like we talked about at the outset of the conversation, from a skeptical lens. And I want to start with microcredit because my sister-in-law, a random story, but so she's from Bangladesh. Her dad worked with Mohammed Yunus, and who is the inventor of, or the big player anyway, in social credit. And so I ended up looking into this, and I was like, oh, this is fascinating. But then I read your work, and I found that it's so interesting to look at all these different angles. So would you mind starting off by maybe explaining like what microcredit is, and then what some of your analysis has shown, what some of the considerations are that you're batting around?
Okay. So yeah, I wrote a book called Due Diligence, which I'm rather proud of. I think people might like it, which is an in-depth investigation of microfinance, which is giving financial services to poor people, mostly in poor countries, and asking the question: does it live up to its reputation for being, you know, a great way to fight poverty? The modern forms of microcredit, well, there's microcredit, which is a type of microfinance, but it really started mostly with credit, and there are reasons for that. You know, business reasons for that. modern microcredit sort of emerged in the 1970s through a few different threads, but a very important one was in Bangladesh with the work of the man you just mentioned, Muhammad Yunus, who went on to win a Nobel Prize for that work. And he built something called the Grameen Bank, which scaled up to the point where it was making regular loans, once or twice a year to millions of people, mostly poor women in Bangladesh. And this generated a huge amount of excitement because along with the numbers about how fast it was growing, there were stories of women who got a loan, bought a cow, sold the milk, gained some economic independence from their abusive husbands, this kind of thing. And so it drew a lot of philanthropic interests, although Muhammad Yunus himself wanted very little support. He wanted to be an independent business. He wanted his own independence. But it became a global movement and generated a lot of excitement. And I think to some extent is responsible for the more general interest now in what is sometimes called social business, or social investing. Notion that you can support businesses in developing countries that are working like businesses, but helping people who need help. And so there did develop a bit of a mythology. Some people over promoted it and went beyond what the evidence really showed about how well it worked. And so there was this idea that, to use a cliche, that microcredit was a silver bullet against poverty.
And just to make sure I check my mental model here, as I recall, at least when I heard it pitched to me, the idea was, so we tend to target, these sort of more impoverished communities, women in particular, because they tend to think more in terms of community interests rather than men who maybe on average will tend to be a little bit more risk-taking with their behavior, engage in less like community-oriented goals. Is that sort of fair characterization?
That's a theory, yes. That's a story that was told about it. Whether it's actually true is another question, right?
Yeah.
But yes, you're absolutely right in reflecting the kinds of thinking around it.
Okay.
Yes, in Bangladesh and in a lot of other places, microcredit was done mostly in groups. So 5 women would form a group and they would all borrow the same amount at the same time. And then they had weekly meetings where they had to make their regular payments, which there were a lot of business reasons for doing that. It wasn't purely, it was described as cultivating solidarity among women, using mutual support. But it was also a way of improving efficiency since you only had to have 1 meeting if you're a bank officer rather than 5. And there's a role of public shaming. If you don't show up with your loan payment, then the other women won't be released from the meeting. So then you become embarrassed, and that improves the repayment rate. So the reality and the appearance were often different things. At the same time, so I've already said some, hinted that there was some mythology and its benefits were exaggerated, and I do think that's true. At the same time, I do think it's important to understand that if you are a poor person in a poor country, it doesn't just mean that your income is low. It's not like you have an annual salary of, $1,000 a year that you can plan on. It means your income is volatile and unpredictable, right? And it also means you have less insurance against emergencies, like if your husband breaks his leg and can't earn any money. And so poor people find all sorts of tricks and techniques and informal ways of managing their money to navigate these very difficult waters. They may borrow with each other. They may give their savings to somebody they trust just so they're out of their hands. The money is out of the house and the husband can't spend it. They may go to money lenders on the corner. They will do all sorts of things to manage. And if a large institution that is not going to disappear overnight comes in and treats them respectfully and offers them a better quality service than they can get from the corner money lender, maybe that's actually a good thing. It may not change their lives, but I don't think it would be a glib to just dismiss it as useless. And one has to approach with humility the decisions that poor people themselves are making to manage their difficult lives. So I came to a rather balanced view in the book that I think the project of trying to improve and institutionalize the financial services that are available to poor people is a good thing. Like any attempt to deliver financial services, it has risks, especially when it comes to credit.
Yeah.
If you over enthusiastically, disperse credit, you can easily get in trouble, and that has happened in the microcredit world, just as it happened with mortgages in the United States some years ago. So the more that the movement can move away from credit and overly enthusiastic delivery of credit towards micro savings and micro insurance, the better off we'll be. And I think actually it may be an area where it's better to put in less money as a philanthropist, because when lots of eager investors want to put money into it, that pushes the system towards credit.
Yeah.
And that's where it's actually most dangerous.
Okay. That's really interesting, because there's so many analogs to even our current market conditions. Like, when credit is really cheap, people start throwing their money at riskier and riskier things because those are the only things that can generate any kind of return. And you skew the entire financial apparatus in a directions, in some cases, orthogonal to where it should be. What was in your analysis of the upside? I'm curious, like, what were some of the limitations on the upside, or what were some of the areas where like the narrative starts to break down a little bit?
Well, one part of my project was to look at the existing economics research on the impact of microcredit. And this sort of brings us back to data science. When I started the project, there had been no randomized studies of the impact of microcredit, which was sort of, it's kind of the gold standard. It's what we use to decide whether a drug is safe and effective. We randomly give it to some people and not others. And that had not been done with microcredit or most other things that are done to try to help poor people in developing countries. But there were some non-randomized studies where you just go and look at people who had microcredit and those who didn't, and in clever ways try to look for instruments, if people know what those are, try to find natural experiments in the data and argue that you have made a comparison between those who got microcredit and those who didn't, that it actually gives insight into the impacts. And the leading study until the randomized studies appeared was something that Muhammad Yunus, who you mentioned earlier, had cited, like in Scientific American. It showed that microcredit did reduce poverty in Bangladesh, especially when it was given to women. But the math was really complicated. And I ended up spending a lot of time writing my own code to implement the methods based on maximum likelihood, and then working with Jonathan Morduck, rerun the original study, and eventually finding all sorts of problems in it and concluding that its original findings was not accurate, and probably a better estimate of the impact was 0.
Wow.
And then the randomized studies came along and mostly said the same thing, that if you look at the overall poverty level, it doesn't really seem to change. But there are bits of evidence that suggest that people were able to manage their financial lives, going hungry less often, for example, that they were able to stabilize things with the use
things
of
that are difficult to measure,
available to them. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's something fascinating about that category of problem, and it's one that you've explored in so many different ways. You have a whole bunch of different projects that you've done, digging into kind of established, maybe call them like consensus ideas, and looking at whether they hold up to scrutiny. And in many cases, you mentioned complexity. It seems like that's a really big part of the issue here, where anytime you have a problem that's sufficiently complex, people, if anybody's listening who does actual like model building for data science, like, how much you can move the needle with hyperparameter optimizations, how much you can overfit. Like, it really seems like this is one issue where people end up shouting different models at each other rather than actually looking at data or looking at uncertainties between models. How do you develop confidence in that context? And moreover, actually, if you can't develop confidence, like, how do you make a call in the context of that level of uncertainty?
Right. This is something that I think economics has struggled with a lot and maybe made more progress on than other fields in a couple ways, although there's still a lot to do. One answer is that, this may not really translate to bread and butter data science, is that one of the appeals of randomization, randomized experiments, is not just that they're obviously compelling, but that they're mathematically simple. You've got a control and a treatment group. You look at the mean in the one and the mean in the other, and do some basic statistics. Of course, like everything, you can start to complicate it. And they do get complicated. I don't know if that translates to data science in general. Another important step that has been taken, and it's a gradual development, is making research more transparent. So I say that when I run the results this way, I get this. Well, there's a growing expectation that I put my code and data online.
Right.
And that allows people to challenge me. It may also change my behavior and prevent me from just tuning the hyperparameters too much, because I know someone will figure out that that was the key to their getting the results that maybe got me published. So I think we need to see a lot more of that in other social science. There's been a real crisis in psychology arguably brought about by the lack of transparency in research. And there may be a place for that more and more in machine learning. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it always seems so potentially counterproductive just because that those hyperparameters, the degree of freedom that opens up is
Yep.
such that you now, it's almost like everything has the risk of becoming political to some degree, where people have their pre-existing notions and they'll say like, okay, I mean, I can argue for anything from the data,
Yep.
so I will.
Right. Another innovation, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
is, and this I think, I mean, I said economics has made progress, probably medicine was ahead of economics in all this. Another innovation is pre-registration. You
Yeah.
post your analysis plan on a third-party site, right, which gives it credibility that they will keep a complete history, sort of like a GitHub, complete history of that analysis plan. And you can change the plan. You can do analyses that you did not plan, but it's clear to everybody what was, prepared and what was done on the fly, ad hoc.
Yeah, and there's this. It seems like there's a delicate dance between like, between confirming things like running studies that we almost know the answer to because like we can pin them down so much, and then running studies where it's almost like we're learning more than we should, not more than we should, but like we're exploring a space that's too unexplored, where anything that we learn can be overfit to. Like there's just not enough to chew on. I'm just remembering the other end of the spectrum. I've mentioned this actually once before on the podcast, but when I was doing graduate school in physics, we would run experiments whose results we would begin by knowing. I mean, this was the default, right? The number of times that you should expect a violation of like Schrodinger's equations or like general relativity in a physics lab, I mean, that is basically zero. And one interesting consequence of this is you actually have knobs that you can move around on your experimental setup. And you naturally have a temptation to say, look, what is the prior probability that I'm going to get a result that doesn't accord with like Newton and Einstein and so on? It should be zero. So what you find yourself doing is going, oh man, I'm not confirming my priors. Okay, I need to tweak these knobs. And you basically overfit until you confirm everything that you always thought you knew. And in a weird way, this establishes even more trust in a foundation of beliefs that could be shaky. If people just dared to accept sort of out-of-band experiments, I wonder if there's sort of a similar self-perpetuating dynamic in this space too, where, I guess one way to ask this question would be, how often do you find yourself challenging a body of work, not just an individual paper, but a whole bunch of studies that seem to be following a consistent narrative or even running consistent or getting consistent results from data that seems to be wrong?
Yeah, it may be different in economics because we don't really have any laws that anybody believes.
Yeah.
There's a law of supply and demand, but it,
even then,
it only gets you so far.
Yeah.
I mean, I should explain that a lot of what my career has been, and this again not planned, it's what I stumbled into, is has been the kind of pattern I described with the microcredit study, where I come across a literature that speaks to a question that I've decided to investigate, like, does putting more people in prison reduce crime, right? Or does giving microcredit to poor people make them better off? And I feel like, well, if I'm going to be an expert on these issues, then I need to really understand these studies. And when there's controversy or complexity in them, I have often felt driven to actually rerun the studies myself, obtain the data or reconstruct it, run the methods and so on. And I have no advanced degree, but people assume I'm an economist and I'm not. So I'm kind of an outsider to the field. And maybe that's part of why I've gone this way. I'm just the world's most annoying consumer of research. And so my pattern has often been to look at a study and say, that looks pretty good, but maybe I should just check or run it this way. And about half the time, I end up being unconvinced by the original claims in the study. I don't think it's because they were just trying to, conform some well-known economic law. It tends to be more that if you get a non-zero result, that's more publishable. If you're a junior, and you're looking for tenure, you're going to be especially drawn to finding those non-zero results. There's rewards for methodological sophistication, which can often backfire, I found. There's a bunch of forces at work.
And what do you think, because this seems to imply some pretty disturbing things about what we think of as expertise. and what we think of and who we think of as experts. I think maybe that's more to the point. The world's so complicated, right? I mean, we need to outsource our dimensionality reduction of like these incredibly complex problems to people who are specialized. But then if our process for identifying specialists is peer review, that seems not to work terribly well. So not that I would expect you to have any solutions, because this is like probably the biggest open problem in human understanding the world. But from a sense making standpoint, like how do you see this playing out? Like, do you think we're naturally going to evolve better systems, or do you think, I don't know, what do you think?
No, it's true. We have experts on all sorts of things in our society, engineering, criminology, and so on. Almost all those experts function inside human communities, which we know create all sorts of weird incentives, because you worry about offending your peers and getting tenure and getting published and lots of other things. And there's a tendency to go along with conventional wisdom. But there are also rewards for saying something that nobody else is saying. And so I think these communities of knowledge do self-correct over time, not nearly fast enough. I mean, I've just described some changes that are happening in economics, and I think are slowly spreading to other areas. But there are some real problems, and I've wondered whether there's just a limit to what academic publishing can do. To be more specific, I was struck, so I took this question, the style of analysis that I just described to you, I took it to the question of incarceration and crime as a part of an act of critical thinking about grant making we're doing at Open Philanthropy around criminal justice reform. And I was struck by the end, I was able to rerun about 8 of the core studies, and 4 of them just, I think I took apart. I just think they were wrong. And one of the ones that was right, it was like so obviously right. It wasn't a randomized experiment, but it was so close. You just look at the graphs, it was like clearly right, end of discussion. And so what I realized is that these pieces of research, at least their goal was to influence policy making around millions of lives, billions and billions of dollars of spending. And they had received peer review that you might value at $1,000.
Yeah.
Look at the value of the time that the economists who put into reviewing it. And from a societal point of view, that cannot be optimal. We're spending $1,000 to review research with billion-dollar implications. I don't think academic publishers can fix that.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure how much academia can directly fix it. If that means doing more thorough review. I'm not sure they have the money or the incentive. So it might require governments and philanthropists to be engaging more systematically in-depth review of research that is relevant for policy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In one sentence there, I think you brought into sharp relief the whole thing. I mean, yeah, how are we spending $1,000 to review a $2 billion idea or something? Yeah, wow. Well, so much to chew on. I really appreciate it. I know we're actually a little bit over time here, so I will let go of the reins here. But thank you so much for your time on this, David. It's a fascinating conversation. I will flag for anybody who's interested, the book is Due Diligence. So if you want to check that out, we will include a link to it in the podcast, in the blog post that'll accompany this podcast as well. David, thanks so much. And do you have a website that people can go to follow your work?
Oh, I do have a site, davidroodman.com. I don't maintain it that actively, but it's sort of a base if you're trying to figure out who I am.
Great. Okay, we'll link to that as well, just so people have it. Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the chat. This is a lot of fun.
It's been a real pleasure.
Awesome. So I'll stop the recording there.